Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
The struggle for freedom is not the same as the freedom struggle. I think to be human means to be always struggling for freedom, because it is a constant dialectic of freedom and oppression. There are always forces that are seeking to oppress us. Even for those who feel that they are liberated, to keep the torture freedom alive. Then in another fundamental sense, which I couldn't really address at all, but I can only hint at it, the view that one would have to take is that no one is free if someone else is unfree. Once it has been uttered, it may sound like a commonplace, but I have to say to my listeners and to myself that this was the most brilliant insight of Mohandas Gandhi.
You just heard historian Dr. Vinay Lal, Professor of History and Asian American Studies at UCLA. The Indians is a collection of essays by some of South Asia's foremost historians and scholars that maps the origins, evolution, and present-day reality of India's civilization and people. The collection covers a period of some 12,000 years, from the last Ice Age to the 21st century. This BIC Talks mini-series, Histories of a Civilization, glimpses into the collection, presenting readings from selected essays interspersed with conversations with the scholar who wrote them, providing a sampling of the various topical discourses that cover the epochs of the subcontinent, and hopes to encourage our listeners to take a deep dive into what makes the Indian.
Do you recall the time when we first thought of the idea of having such a book? And how possible or impossible did it look at that time to you?
It was something like about a year ago, I think, that you had, I think, broached the idea. It might have been a bit more than a year, perhaps, but it wasn't that far back in time. And I must say, getting this book out, within a year or so seems to me to be extraordinarily remarkable. I'm not altogether surprised, given that you had taken this initiative. If someone else had, I suspect it wouldn't have happened. But did I think it was possible at that time? Knowing that you had taken the initiative, I thought it was possible. And that's one reason I consented to take part in it.
Well, thank you. You have written several brilliant essays in this book. Two of them relate to the independence movement. I would like our listeners to know about your own engagement in the history of independence movement, modern India. You've written a number of brilliant books in the area, but since so much is written already about independence movement in India, why and how your interest is of a different nature than the other historians. If you can please share some of your take on the idea of independence, whether there's continuity of ideas of freedom in Indian tradition prior to the colonial times, or this is a typically colonial product of Indian brand. Would you like to comment on this?
Right. So I think that there are many different dimensions to the question that you've asked, and I'll try to address some of them. I think a lot more can be said, of course, but I'll try to address some of them and do so rather succinctly if I can. So the first consideration for me is this, namely that, as you have pointed out, a lot has been written on the freedom struggle. I think in India, that has been the phrase that we have liked to use, and we've liked to use it since the time that we acquired independence. I mean, there were historians back in the 40s and 50s who were already writing, looking back at what had just transpired just a few years ago, were already writing about the freedom struggle in India. And so for someone like myself, of course, one of the fundamental questions is, how does one think through this, given that there is a very large literature on this. Lots of people have reflected on it, not just historians, but philosophers, poets, writers, social scientists. Then there's another set of considerations, which is a very different set of considerations. And perhaps the essays I've written don't really reflect that. But given the nature of this work, there were some constraints. Those sets of considerations have to do with thinking about freedom in a more general sense, because surely the history of humankind is preeminently the history of the struggle for freedom. When we say the freedom struggle, we are referring in India to the anti colonial struggle, which was anchored by people like Mohandas Gandhi, Nehru, many others. There's a different approach one can take there as well, because it may have been anchored by them, but it involved the masses. And of course, here I cannot get into the many complex questions that have been raised by Indian historiography, particularly, I would say, since the early 1980s, when a school of thought called the subaltern school came about, which began to question very seriously. I mean, the Marxists had done it too in their own way. This was a significant departure, and that was whether we move away from the history of something called the freedom struggle by concentrating on people such as Gandhi or Nehru or Azad or the so-called great men, sometimes a few women, and whether we think really more of the aspiration for freedom from below. So then we would have to think about the role of the working class, we would have to think about peasant struggles, so forth and so on.
What you say makes eminent sense to me, and the way you open your essay, it's very original to my mind. I mean, you said, I'm reading out the first sentence. The conventional history of freedom struggle in India generally commences either with the rebellion of 57 and sometimes with the founding of the Indian National Congress in 85. Neither account is wholly satisfactory. I mean, I like it because I tend to think that the freedom struggle was not just for creating a free nation, but it was also for internationalization of India.
Oh, yes, yes,
Tagore
yes,
thought, yeah,
sure.
and that I think that aspect your essay brings in, but because the space was limited, it's not fully. So, if you can comment on that, please.
Right, right. So I think that when I began the essay, I did so with the thought precisely that not just historians, but people more generally, they're obsessed with things like chronology. So should we think of 1857? Because after all, you have figures such as the Rani of Jhansi, and then you have people like Savarkar, who wrote on 1857 as the first war of Indian independence, echoing, of course, the struggle that had taken place in the colonies in the Americas, and more particularly, of course, the struggle of the states on the Atlantic seaboard, which then led to the creation of the United States. And that was prefaced by what is called the Declaration of Independence. So when Savarkar was talking about the first war of Indian independence, he is certainly echoing another kind of history there as well. But what I was trying to suggest a few minutes ago is something else. I'm thinking of a different kind of temporality when I suggest that, you see, there is a kind of a fatal problem, but this is the terms that I have to work with. And that problem is that the struggle for freedom is not the same as the freedom struggle. Okay. I think to be human means to be always struggling for freedom, because it is a constant dialectic of freedom and oppression. There are always forces that are seeking to oppress us. And it's a constant struggle, even for those who feel that they are liberated, to keep the torture freedom alive. Then, in another fundamental sense, which I couldn't really address at all, but I can only hint at it, the view that one would have to take is that no one is free if someone else is unfree. And I think, incidentally, that was, I mean, it may sound like once it has been uttered, it may sound like a commonplace, but I have to say to my listeners and to myself that this was the most brilliant insight of Mohandas Gandhi. Why Gandhi in particular? Why is it, for example, that at the height of the anti colonial struggle, Gandhi was always able to gain the sympathy of people, even in the West? even in England. When he goes to England in 1930, okay, for the Round Table Conference, and then he goes to Lancashire, you see that extraordinary photograph. The boycott that had been initiated by the Indian National Congress at the behest of Gandhi, which hurt the people in Lancashire, which hurt the people who worked in the mills. These same people received Gandhi with open arms. There's this extraordinary photograph where he's standing with these 30, 40 women and men, and they're all beaming. Right? I mean, it's just brilliant. And what makes that possible? What makes that possible is his insight that the anti colonial struggle in India was designed not just to liberate India from the British, it was designed to liberate the British from their own worst tendencies. When we think about oppression, the oppressor is also oppressed in a certain way, you see, and Gandhi fundamentally understood that.
Writing about the freedom struggle in the aftermath of independence, Jawaharlal Nehru and Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay were among the stalwarts of the movement who were unambiguously clear that the arrival of Mohandas Gandhi altogether altered the Indian political scene. He came, Kamaladevi recalled in her memoirs, as a comet, and everything that had preceded him disappeared from public memory. In some accounts, he obliterated, if not by design, all opposition. Others speak of him as the virtual dictator of the Congress. Gandhi had returned to India in early 1915 after 2 decades in South Africa. As Nelson Mandela was to put it much later, he arrived in Natal as Mohandas and left as the Mahatma. If British liberal commentators were wont to believe, Indian nationalists had derived their notions of freedom from Blackstone, Locke, Mill, and other European philosophers and political theorists. The very first laboratory of Satyagraha was also crafted overseas, in South Africa. In South Africa, however, the Indians were but a minority, and Gandhi had not involved the African population in the struggle. India was to furnish a different testing ground. Gandhi, now in his native land, first sought to reacquaint himself with the country he left when he was in his early 20s. Only a year after his arrival, he signaled with a stirring speech at the Banaras Hindu University that raised a furor that he was determined to make his presence felt. It was superfluous to ask for independence from Britain and in the end get a brown sahib in the place of a white sahib if Indians were not prepared to put their house in order and liberate themselves from the shackles of mental servitude. Of what use was freedom, Gandhi asked, if educated Indians were embarrassed to use an Indian language to speak in public? In the following years, partly in an attempt to familiarize himself with the struggles of peasants and the working class, he would involve himself in the local struggles in Champaran and in Ahmedabad. Meanwhile, though World War I was not India's war as such, India contributed handsomely to the war effort as part of the British Empire, but got only brickbats in return. The government armed itself with extraordinary powers of political repression, arguing that the resort by Indian revolutionaries to armed violence against the state necessitated the curtailment of ordinary liberties, and Gandhi devised upon an extraordinary and novel response in the form of a call for a nationwide day of prayer and boycott. With this stroke of political genius, Gandhi came to the attention of the country, where before Bengal and Western India in particular were the arenas of political activity. For the first time, much of the country appeared to have a stake in the struggle for freedom. In Punjab, where the colonial state assumed the Indian masses were inert, indifferent to politics, and likely to look upon colonial rulers as their Mai-Bap, the British responded to the call for self-determination with panic and ferocity. Villages were strafed from the air, and students and disobedient people were flogged in public. But in Amritsar, the retribution for defiance took more unusual and draconian forms. In the incident of the crawling lane, the humiliation of an Englishwoman was avenged by having Indians crawl on their bellies, and at Jallianwala Bagh, near the Golden Temple, Brigadier General Reginald Dwyer, commanding a regiment of Indian troops, ordered firing upon a large crowd of unarmed Indians that left at least 379 dead and 1,000 people injured.
Gandhi's ascendancy to the helm of nationalist politics would be swift. He launched the non-cooperation movement in 1920 and, as archival records suggest, succeeded in paralyzing colonial administration in parts of North India. He had transformed the Congress, a nationalist organization comprised largely of elites with very modest aspirations for some form of representation, into a mass organization with over 1 million paid members. It was Gandhi's singular achievement to bring the masses into the public sphere throughout the country and make them into a motive force of history. In 1922, however, at the small market town of Chauri Chaura, an incident of mob violence in which 22 policemen were burned or hacked to death made Gandhi suspend the movement. Much to the consternation of his fellow congressmen, among them Motilal Nehru, his son Jawaharlal, Lajpat Rai, and C.R. Das, who thought that they had the British licked. It may be said that Gandhi's suspension of the non-cooperation movement, though mistakenly decried by many as a colossal political blunder, is one of the supreme moments in modern global political history, as it underscored for the first time the view that there can be no principled politics without ethics. To the British, Gandhi appeared to have lost nerve. They used the opportunity to convict him on charges of sedition, and he was sentenced to a 6-year term in prison. The Great Trial, where Gandhi issued a stinging denunciation of colonial rule, is one of the most iconic moments of the freedom struggle, and it demonstrated, as did other political trials in colonial India, such as those of Sri Aurobindo, Bhagat Singh, the communists, and other political leaders, the mastery of the courtroom achieved by Indians. Thus, as the British would learn at a heavy cost, the very instrumentalities of law and order would be turned against them. Though the most pivotal moments in the history of the freedom struggle were initiated by Gandhi, they acquired a momentum of their own and came to be claimed by the masses. The Salt Satyagraha of 1930, which brought the story of the Indian independence movement to doors and rooftops around the world, was as much spectacular political theater as it was the most ingenious defiance of oppressive rule ever witnessed in history. Gandhi marched to the sea to break the salt law and left everyone astonished at the sheer simplicity and audacity of his move and the uncanny awareness that he showed of the power of the symbolic universe that we inhabit. Tens of thousands went to jail, many willingly, and the Salt Satyagraha brought women into the streets in large numbers. In his deployment of nonviolence in this fashion, Gandhi opened a new chapter in the evolution of human consciousness, though then and now, some critics saw in him nothing more than a charlatan. One of the most distinct characteristics of the freedom struggle as it was conceptualized and waged by Gandhi is that it inspired debates of the highest intellectual and ethical order, as can be witnessed in the intense exchange between Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. Gandhi admired Gurudev as much as Tagore lionized the Mahatma, but this did not prevent them from airing their differences with intellectual rigor. Tagore decried what he called the cult of the charkha, the blind submission of the masses to Gandhi's own dictates, and the negativity attached to non-cooperation. For his part, Gandhi averred that Tagore appeared to have a suspicion of the masses, a dread of the negative, and an unawareness of the manner in which a people who had long been inert had been aroused to fulfill their political destiny.
Tagore did not live to see India acquire independence. passing on exactly a year before Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in August 1942. Gandhi was prepared to see India descend into ordered anarchy rather than have the British stay in India, and he prepared the country for the final upheaval with the mantra, do or die. The government responded with oppression, and nearly the entire leadership of the Congress was taken into jail and only released after 2 years. But Gandhi's call was interpreted by many to resort to whatever means they thought fit to resist British rule. Some political rebels engaged in sabotage of railway tracks and government properties to disrupt lines of communication. Other activists went into hiding, and the intrepid Usha Mehta broadcast from the secret Congress radio. From the standpoint of the Congress, at least, the All India Muslim League, now headed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, engaged in another, more insidious form of sabotage by rendering political cooperation to the British. Certainly, if 1942 to 1944 was a period of political wilderness for the Congress, it was for the Muslim League a time when it assiduously advanced its own interests and was able to make substantial headway in successfully placing the demand for a separate nation state for the Indian Muslims before them. While the Congress spearheaded the freedom struggle, Indians of other political persuasions sought freedom from the oppressiveness of British rule in their own fashion. Though the Muslim League had been founded in 1906 with the aim to which the British gave every encouragement of increasing Muslim participation in the political life of the nation and representing the interests of Muslims, the Congress continued to attract the support of the vast majority of Muslims well into the 1930s. Muslim leaders such as Shaukat Ali and his brother Muhammad Ali, who was staunch congressman and supported Gandhi's non cooperation program much as he lent his name to the Khilafat campaign, gradually drifted away from the Congress, and Shaukat Ali formally joined the Muslim League in 1936. However, this may have also had the effect of pulling some Hindus away from the Congress, and those who viewed themselves as nationalist Hindus started gravitating towards the Hindu Mahasabha, founded in Nagpur in 1915. Another faction within the Congress itself developed in 1936 into the Congress Socialist Party, CSP, whose members cavilled at the Congress Party's disinclination to embrace a more explicit socialist program and its reluctance to push for more sweeping land reforms. Long before the CSP came about, the Bolshevik Revolution had already animated those Indians who dreamt of freeing Indians both of colonial rule and the conservatism of a bourgeois social order. The Communist Party of India was founded in December 1925, and it played a considerable role in mobilizing peasants throughout the countryside and promoting trade union activity. Armed revolutionaries continued to operate clandestinely, but with the emergence of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, HSRA, they were able to offer more concerted resistance to the colonial state and were a source of much discussion and anxiety in official circles. Though the HSRA was short lived, surviving for less than a decade, its luminaries such as Chandrasekhar Azad, Shivram Rajguru, Sukhdev, Ashfaqullah Khan, and Ram Prasad Bismil, all killed in their manhood in the resistance movement, were nationally celebrated figures. None was more legendary than Bhagat Singh, who was not all of 30 before he was sent to the gallows, and whose fame is said to have rivaled that of Gandhi's for a short period of time. The HSRA's ideological platform suggests a fidelity to socialism, secularism, and the rights of the working class. Though the HSRA did not repudiate non-violent resistance as such, its members claimed a complementary place for violent methods as expounded in their manifesto, The Philosophy of the Bomb. Unlike the HSRA revolutionaries, Subhash Chandra Bose was a congressman, but he was similarly not averse to armed resistance to the colonial state. Bose would go on to become the leader of the Indian National Army, INA, comprised of Indian recruits from Southeast Asia and prisoners of war from the British India Army, and the INA would see limited, if unsuccessful, military engagement in Northeast India and Burma during World War II. A few commentators allege that it is Bose who finally pushed the British to quit India, though this view is more wishful thinking than evidence of a reasoned consideration of the course of the freedom struggle. Following the conclusion of the war, lengthy negotiations by the British for their withdrawal from India ensued with the Congress and the Muslim League. But the vivisection of India and the creation of the Muslim majority state of Pakistan could not be averted. Though India became free on 15th August 1947, Gandhi at least was certain that the freedom thus gained was not what he had envisioned. India had become an independent nation state. Gandhi was to write just before his assassination on 30th January 1948, but its people still had to acquire economic, cultural, and social rights. In like fashion, we may say that the narrative of the freedom struggle cannot be written wholly in the idiom of politics. A more comprehensive narrative would have to take stock of how artists, writers, students, craftsmen, women, and ordinary people contributed to the struggle for the liberation of India, and similarly, it would have to be attentive to efforts, fledgling as they may have been, to decolonize the mind. What is also equally critical, all the more so because conventional histories have been largely impervious to such consideration, is the efforts by the likes of Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Bose, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay to forge transnational links with other colonized peoples and intellectuals of ecumenical dispensation in the West. There can be little doubt that whatever one's estimation of Gandhi and of the idea of satyagraha, the freedom struggle in India was wholly unique and constitutes not merely a chapter in the global history of anti colonialism, but even more so, a singularly distinct chapter in the still evolving history of nonviolence and man's ascent into higher levels of consciousness.
Thank you. It's amazing how you captured in these two short essays the complete story in its completeness. And you summed up very beautifully that the freedom struggle is not just for freedom of a nation, but the idea of freedom, evolving idea of freedom. I am tempted to read out the concluding sentence of your second essay, where Professor Lal, you said, there can be little doubt that whatever one's estimation of Gandhi and of the idea of this satyagraha, the freedom struggle in India was wholly unique and constitutes not merely a chapter in the global history of anti-colonialism, but even more so a singularly distinct chapter in the still evolving history of non-violence and man's ascent into higher levels of consciousness. I think this idea of freedom as part of consciousness and not just freedom as part of a political delivery is what makes our history very unique. And your essays on this history equally unique. Thank you for writing, contributing to this book. Just as you contributed these brilliant essays, many eminent scholars contributed their parts, short essays, making this book possible. I feel, as its editor, a great sense of satisfaction that despite the unevenness, the book presents some kind of a different view of a nation which does not stand to benefit by taking too much of a pride in being a nation, but will gain a lot by realizing its internationality, its presence in the community of nations.
Thank you very much, Professor Devy, for your very kind remarks about my essay. But as you said, this is a book with 100 some essays, and it's a collaborative effort, collaborative attempt. I think that that's also significant. I think collaborations of this sort are much needed, partly because they also suggest the possibilities of solidarity. And I think, given the political climate in which we are living, all such instances of solidarity are to be welcomed. But I think this project in particular is, I think, critically important. And so I have to congratulate you, first of all, for having thought about this project and having taken the initiative to move it forward. So, why do I think it's critically important at this juncture? Before I comment on that, I just want to go back. I want to remind everyone that just a few days before Gandhi was assassinated on 30th January 1948, just a few days before that, he was drafting what is informally described as his last will and testament. What it really was it was the draft constitution of the Congress Party. Okay, now I think the last volume of the collected works, that is volume 98, collected works of Gandhi. Volumes 99 and 100 are the index volumes. So volume 98 is really the last volume there. The last volume has a number of very important documents, including the draft constitution. But on a number of occasions, Gandhi had said very clearly, and what he said at that time is just as true today as it was then. In fact, if anything, it is even more true today, I would say. What is it that he said? He said very simply, he said, we have gained our political rights, but we still have to think about economic independence, social independence, cultural independence, and of course, though he didn't spell it out, intellectual independence, because of course, decolonization is something that remains an imperative even today. Not in the way in which I hasten to add, the present government of India speaks about decolonization because they have something very different in mind. What they would like to do is they would like to eradicate entire periods of Indian history. What Gandhi was really speaking about when he was speaking about decolonization was something much more profound, and that is that the categories of thought that we use, categories that we use in our social sciences, for the most part, these categories have all been inherited from the social sciences as they were practiced in the West for 150, 200 years, especially since the late 19th century. And so when we think about poverty, Gandhi's submission was that we have to think about poverty in a very different way than the economist in the West thinks about it, and the economist in India today thinks about it, because most economists today think alike, no matter where they are. It's precisely because the social sciences as they were practiced in the West have really been completely universalized in many ways. Today, very recently, in the last few weeks, a Japanese economist has become a much talked about figure. This particular Japanese economist has talked about degrowth. Degrowth. The entire profession of economics would collapse if a number of economists started taking the idea of degrowth seriously, because all of economics is built on the principle of growth. But who was the greatest critic that we had of the idea of growth? It was Gandhi. Let's go back to Hind Swaraj. And that brings up another point, which is that even though I also wrote on the freedom struggle, I think we have to think about the word Swaraj, because the word Swaraj is richer in many ways. And let's recall what Gandhi was doing in Hind Swaraj very briefly. That Hind Swaraj was an argument not just for the self-determination of India, right? That's Swaraj. That's one form of Swaraj, is self-determination. It is only, however, one dimension. The other dimension is we have to liberate ourselves from our own worst tendencies. We have to gain rule over our own self. This is a different way of thinking about freedom. That's what Gandhi was doing, of course, I think, in Hind Swaraj. So this draft constitution and what Gandhi says about the fact that, look, independence cannot simply be some kind of political autonomy, because what does a political autonomy really mean to the masses of India? And so he's very clear about this. And I think that this is one meaning of freedom that we must persist in thinking about. Now, I would suggest that this book is another attempt to make us think about a more capacious sense of freedom. Because what is this enterprise about? That Professor Devy, that you have undertaken in collaboration with myself and dozens of other scholars. It is a way to think about our past. Because when we think about temporality, we can only think of the past from something called the present. And now, what the essays are seeking to do here is to give us a more capacious sense of how we think about the past, how we wrestled with these questions of autonomy, of freedom. And I dare say that this question is critically important, because think about this, that every speech our prime minister makes, almost every speech he makes, he says, we have to free ourselves from 1,200 years of slavery. 1,200, not 200 years that people used to typically talk about, which was roughly the colonial period, roughly 1,200 years, because of course he's also including, let's say, the 1,000 years, give or take 100 years here or there, of Muslim rule, beginning in North India, then moving down into South India. And then you include the entire colonial period. Then you include the entire period after independence until 2014, which is when the BJP was first elected. The present dispensation came into power at that time. Before that, it's all slavery. It's all slavery, gulami. That word has been used by him and many others hundreds of times. Now, if we are speaking about the freedom struggle, those two essays that I wrote, you can see how it seems to me that not just those two essays, but the entire enterprise is an enterprise to say that, well, we need to have a different understanding of freedom and what this idea has really meant in the Indian imagination. So I think that this enterprise must be thought in that sense as well. It's an attempt not just to reclaim the past in a different way or to set the record straight, which would be another way of describing it. I'm a little uncomfortable with that because no one can set the record straight, so to speak. That is, that history is always a matter of contention and should be to some degree. It's a matter of interpretation, right? How we think of it. Of course, some accounts are more compelling than others. I think we have to recognize that. But beyond all of that, this book should also be construed as an attempt to think about the very idea of autonomy, freedom, and self-determination.
Professor Lal, thank you. Thank you for contributing to the book. Thank you for your comments on the freedom movement. And indeed, Swaraj is a goal towards which India is evolving, progressing.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.